The Eternal World by Clark Ashton Smith. Christopher Chandon went to his laboratory window for a last look at the mountain solitude about him, which, in all likelihood, he would never see again. With no faltering of his determination, and yet not wholly without regret, he stared at the rugged gully beneath, where the Gothic shade of firs and hemlocks was threaded by the brawling silver of a tiny stream. He saw the granite-sheeted slope beyond, and the two nearer peaks of the Sierras, whose slaty azure was tipped by the first autumn snow, and saw the pass between them that lay in a line with his apparent route through the time-space continuum. Then he turned to the strange apparatus whose completion had cost him so many years of toil and experiment. On a raised platform in the center of the room there stood a large cylinder, not without resemblance to a diving bell. Its base and lower walls were of metal. Its upper half was made wholly of indestructible glass. A hammock, inclined at an angle of 40 degrees, was slung between its sides. In this hammock, Chandon meant to lash himself securely, to ensure as much protection as would be feasible against the unknown velocities of his proposed flight. Gazing through the clear glass, he could watch with comfort whatever visual phenomena the journey might offer. The cylinder had been set directly in front of an enormous disk, 10 feet in diameter, with 100 perforations in its silver surface. Behind it were arranged a series of dynamos, designed for the development of an obscure power which, for want of a better name, Chandon had called the negative time force. This power he had isolated with infinite labors from the positive energy of time, that fourth-dimensional gravity which causes and controls the rotation of events. The negative power, amplified 1,000-fold by the dynamos, would remove to an incalculable distance in contemporary time and space anything that stood in its path. It would not permit of travel into the past or future, but would cause an instant projection across the temporal stream that enfolds the entire cosmos in its endless equal flowing. Unfortunately, Chandon had not been able to construct a mobile machine in which he could travel as in a rocket ship, and perhaps return as to his starting point. He must plunge boldly and forever into the unknown, but he had furnished the cylinder with an oxygen apparatus, with electric light and heat, and a month's supply of food and water. Even if his flight should end in empty space, or in some world whose conditions would render human survival impossible, he would at least live long enough to make a thorough observation of his surroundings. He had a theory, however, that his journey would not terminate in the midst of mere ether, that the cosmic bodies were nuclei of the time gravity, and that the weakening of the propulsive force would permit the cylinder to be drawn to one of them. The hazards of his venture were past foreseeing, but he preferred them to the safe, monotonous certitudes of earthly life. He had always chafed beneath a feeling of limitation, had longed only for the unexplored vastness. He could not brook the thought of any horizons other than those which have never been overpassed. With a strange thrilling in his heart, he turned from the alpine landscape and proceeded to lock himself in the cylinder. He had installed a timing device which would automatically start the dynamos at a given hour. Lying in the hammock, beneath leather straps that he had buckled about his waist, ankles, and shoulders, he still had a minute or so to wait before the turning on of the power. In those moments, for the first time, there swept upon him in an unleashed flood the full terror and peril of his experiment, and he was almost tempted to unbind himself and leave the cylinder before it was too late. He had all the sensations of one who is about to be blown from a cannon's mouth. Suspended in a weird silence, from which all sound had been excluded by the airtight walls, he resigned himself to the unknown, with many conflicting surmises as to what would occur. He might or might not survive the passage through unfamiliar dimensions at speed to which the velocity of light would be laggard. but if he did survive, he might reach the farthest galaxies in a mere flash. His fears and surmises were terminated by something that came with the suddenness of sleep, or death. Everything seemed to dissolve and vanish in a bright flare, and then there passed before him a swarming, broken panorama, a babel of impressions, ineffably various and multiplied. It seemed to him that he possessed 1,000 eyes, with which to apprehend in one instant the flowing of many eons, the passing of countless worlds. The cylinder seemed no longer to exist, and he did not appear to be moving. But all the systems of time were going by him, and he caught the scraps and fragments of 1,000,000 scenes, objects, faces, forms, angles, and colors, which he recalled later as one recalls the deliriously amplified and distorted visions of certain drugs. He saw the giant evergreen forests of lichen, the continents of Brobdingnagian grasses, in planets remoter than the systems of Hercules. Before him there passed, like an architectural pageant, the mile-high cities that wear the sumptuous aerial motley of rose and emerald and Tyrian, wrought by the tangent beams of triple suns. He beheld unnameable things in spheres unlisted by astronomers. There crowded upon him the awful and limitless evolutionary range of transstellar life, the cyclorama of teeming morphologies. It seemed as if the barriers of his brain had been extended to include the whole of the cosmic flux, that his thought, like the web of some mammoth and divine arachnidon, had woven itself from world to world, from galaxy to galaxy, above the dread gulfs of the infinite continuum. Then, with the same suddenness that had marked its beginning, the vision came to an end, and was replaced by something of a totally different character. It was only afterward that Chandon could figure out what had occurred, and divine the nature and laws of the new environment into which he had been projected. At the time, if one can use a word so inaccurate as time, he was wholly incapable of anything but a single contemplative visual impression. The strange world upon which he looked through the clear wall of the cylinder, a world that might have been the dream of some geometrician mad with infinity. It was like some planetary glacier, fretted into shapes of ordered grotesquerie, filled with the white, unglittering light, and obeying the laws of other perspectives than those of our own world. The distances on which he gazed were literally interminable. There was no horizon, and yet nothing seemed to dwindle in size or definitude, whatever its remoteness. Part of the impression received by Chandon was that this world arched back upon itself, like the interior surface of a hollow sphere, that the pale vistas returned overhead after they had vanished from his view. Nearer to him than any other object in the scene, and preserving the same relative distance as in his laboratory, he perceived a large circular section of rough planking, that portion of the laboratory wall which had lain in the path of the negative beam. It hung motionless in air, as if suspended by a field of invisible ice. The foreground beyond the planking was thronged by innumerable rows of objects that were suggestive both of statues and of crystalloid formations. Wan as marble or alabaster, each of them presented a melange of simple curves and symmetric angles, which somehow seemed to include the latency of almost endless geometrical development. They were gigantic, with a rudimentary division into head, limbs, and body, as if they were living things. Behind them, at indefinite distances, were other forms that might have been the blind buds or frozen blossoms of unknown vegetable growths. Chandon had no sense of the passing of time as he peered from the cylinder. He could remember nothing, could imagine nothing. He was unaware of his body or the hammock in which he lay, except as a half-seen image on the rim of vision. Somehow, in that strange, frozen impression, he felt the inert dynamism of the forms about him, the silent thunder, the unlaunched lightnings, as of cataleptic gods, the the atom-folded heat and flame as of unlit suns. Inscrutably they brooded before him, as they had done from all eternity and would continue to do forever. In this world there could be no change, no event. All things must preserve the same aspect and the same attitude. As he realized later, his attempts to change his own position in the time stream had led to an unforeseen result. He had projected himself beyond time into some further cosmos where the very ether, perhaps, was a non-conductor of the time force, and in which, therefore, the phenomena of temporal sequence were impossible. The sheer velocity of his flight had lodged him on the verge of this eternity, like some Arctic explorer caught in everlasting ice. There, obedient to the laws of timelessness, he seemed fated to remain. Life, as we know the term, was impossible for him, and yet, since death would involve a time sequence, it was equally impossible for him to die. He must maintain the position in which he had landed, must hold the breath he had been breathing at the moment of his impact against the eternal. He was fixed in a catalepsy of the senses, in a bright nirvana of contemplation. It would seem, according to all logic, that there was no escape from his predicament. However, I must now relate the strangest thing of all, the thing that was seemingly unaccountable, that defied the proven laws of the timeless sphere. Into the glacial field of Chandon's vision, athwart the horizonless ranks of immutable figures, there came an intruding object, a thing that drifted as if through eons, that grew upon the scene with the slowness of some millennial coral reef in a crystal sea. Even from its first appearance, the object was plainly alien to the scene, was obviously, like Chandon's cylinder and the wall section, of non-eternal origin. It was black and lustrous, with more than the blackness of interstellar space or of metals locked from light in the core of planets. It forced itself upon the sight with ultra-material solidity, and yet it seemed to refuse the crystal daylight, to insulate itself from the never-varying splendor. The thing disclosed itself as a sharp and widening wedge, driven upon the adamantine ether, and forming, by the same violent act of eruption, a new visual image in Chandon's paralytic eyes. In defiance of the mental laws of his surroundings, it caused him to form an idea of duration and movement. Seen in its entirety, the thing was a large, spindle-shaped vessel, dwarfing Chandon's cylinder like an ocean liner beside a ship's dinghy. It floated aloof and separate, a seamless mass of unbroken ebon, swelling to an orb-like equator and dwindling to a point at each end. The form was such as might have been calculated to pierce some obdurate medium. The substance of which it had been wrought, and its motive power, were destined to remain unknown to Chandon. Perhaps it was driven by some tremendous concentration of the time force with which he had played so ignorantly and ineptly. The intruding vessel, wholly stationary, hung now above the rows of statuesque entities that were foremost in his field of vision. By infinite gradations, a huge circular door seemed to open in its bottom, and from the opening there issued a crane-like arm, of the same black material as the vessel. The arm ended in numerous pendant bars that somehow gave the idea of finger-like suppleness. It descended upon the head of one of the strange geometric images, and the myriad bars, bending and stretching with slow but limitless fluidity, wrapped themselves like a net of chains about the crystalloid body. Then the figure was dragged upward, as if with Herculean effort, and vanished at length, together with the shortening arm, in the vessel's interior. Again the arm emerged, to repeat the bizarre, impossible abduction, and draw another of the enigmatic things from its everlasting station. And once more the arm descended, and a third entity was taken, like the theft of still another marble god from its marble heaven. All this was done in profound silence. the immeasurable slowness of motion being muffled by the ether and creating nothing that Chandon's ear could apprehend as sound. After the third disappearance with its strange prey, the arm returned, extending itself diagonally and to greater length than before, till the black fingers barred the glass of Chandon's cylinder and closed upon it with their irresistible clutch. He was scarcely aware of any movement, but it seemed to him that the ranks of white figures, the unhorizoned and never-dwindling vistas, were sinking slowly from his ken, like a foundering world. He saw the ebon bulk of the great vessel toward which he was drawn by the shortening arm, till it filled his entire vision. Then the cylinder was lifted into the night-black opening, where it seemed that light was powerless to follow. Chandon could see nothing. He was aware of nothing but solid darkness, enfolding the cylinder even as it had been enfolded by the white, achromatic light of timelessness. He felt about him the sense of long, tremendous vibration, a soundless pulsing that seemed to spread in circles from some dynamic center, to pass over and beyond him through eons, as if from some titanic heart, whose beats defied the environing eternity. Simultaneously, he realized that his own heart was beating again, with the same protraction as this unknown pulse, that he drew breath and exhaled it in obedience to the cyclical vibration. In his benumbed brain there grew the nascent idea of wonder, the first beginning of a natural thought sequence. His body and mind were beginning to function once more, beneath the influence of the power that had been strong enough to intrude upon the timeless universe and pluck him from that petrifying ether. The vibration began to swiffen, spreading outward in mighty ripples. It became audible as a cyclopean pounding, and Chandon somehow conceived the idea of giant-built machinery, turning and throbbing in an underworld prison. The vessel seemed to be forging onward with resistless power through some material barrier. Doubtless it was wrenching itself free from the eternal dimension, was tearing its way back into time. The blackness had persisted for a while, like a positive radiation, rather than the mere absence of light. Now it cleared away and was replaced by an all-revealing ruddy illumination. At the same time, the loud engine-like vibration died to a muted throbbing. Perhaps the darkness had been in some manner associated with the full development of the strange force that had enabled the vessel to move and function in that ultra-temporal medium. With the return into time and the diminishment of power, it had vanished. The faculties of thought, feeling, cognition, and movement, under their normal time aspects, all came back to Chandon like the loosening of a dammed-up flood. He was able to correlate all that occurred to him and infer in some measure the meaning of his unique experience. With growing awe and astonishment, he studied the scene that was visible from his position in the hammock. The cylinder, with the weird crystalloid figures looming near at hand, was reposing in a huge room, probably the main hold of the vessel. The interior of this room was curved like a sphere, and all about and above, gigantic, unfamiliar machineries were disposed. Not far away, he saw the retracted crane or arm. It seemed that the force of gravitation inhered everywhere in the vessel's inner surface, for certain peculiar beings passed before Chandon as he watched, and ran upward on the walls till they hung inverted from the ceiling with the nonchalance of flies. There were perhaps a dozen of those beings within sight. No one with earthly biological prepossessions could ever have imagined them very readily. Each of them possessed a roughly globular body, with the upper hemisphere swelling midway between pole and equator to form two necklace conical heads. The lower hemisphere terminated in many limbs and appendages, some of which were used for walking, and others solely for prehension. The heads were featureless, but a glittering web-like membrane hung between them, trembling continually. Certain of the nether appendages, waving like inquisitive tentacles, were tipped with organs that may have served for eyes, ears, nostrils, and mouths. These creatures shone with the silvery light and appeared to be almost translucent. In the center of the pointed heads, a spot of coal-bright crimson glowed and faded with pulse-like regularity, and the spherical bodies darkened and lightened, as if with the rhythmic interchange of rib-like zones of shadow beneath their surfaces. Chanjin felt that they were formed of some non-protoplasmic substance, perhaps a mineral that had organized itself into living cells. Their movements were very quick and dexterous, with an inhuman poise, and they seemed able to perform many different motions with perfect simultaneity. The Earthman was stricken to renewed immobility by the strangeness of it all. With vain, fantastical surmises, he sought to fathom the mystery. Who were these creatures, and what had been their purpose in penetrating the eternal dimension? Why had they removed certain of its inhabitants, together with himself? Whither was the vessel bound? Was it returning somewhere in time and space to the planetary world from which it had set forth on its weird voyage? He could be sure of nothing, but he knew that he had fallen into the hands of super-scientific beings, who were expert navigators of space-time. They had been able to build a vessel such as he had merely dreamt of building, and perhaps they had explored and charted all the unknown deeps, and had deliberately planned their incursion into the frozen world beyond. If they had not come to rescue him, he would never have escaped from the doom of timelessness into which he had been hurled by his own clumsy effort to cross the secular stream. Pondering, he turned to the giant things that were his companions. He could scarcely recognize them in the red glow. Their pallid planes and angles seemed to have undergone a subtle rearrangement, and the light quivered upon them in bloody lustres, conferring an odd warmth, a suggestion of awakening life. More than ever, they gave the impression of latent power, of frozen dynamism. Then, suddenly, he saw an unmistakable movement from one of the statue-like entities and realized that the thing had begun to alter its shape. The cold marble substance seemed to flow like quicksilver. The rudimentary head assumed a stern, many-featured form, such as might belong to the demigod of some foreign world. The limbs lightened, and new members of indeterminate use were put forth. The simple curves and angles multiplied themselves with mysterious complexity. A diamond-shaped eye, glowing with blue fire, appeared in the face and was quickly followed by other eyes. The thing seemed to be undergoing, in a few moments, the entire process of some long-suspended evolution. Chanjin saw that the other figures were displaying singular alterations, though in each case the ensuing development was wholly individual. The geometric facets began to swell like opening buds, and flowed into lines of celestial beauty and grandeur. The boreal pallor was suffused with unearthly iridescence, with opal tones that raced and trembled in ever-living patterns, in belted arabesques, in rainbow hieroglyphs. The human watcher felt the insurgence of a measureless elan, of a superstellar intellection in these remarkable beings. A thrill of terror, electric, eerie, ran through him. The process he had just seen was too incalculable, too tremendous. Who or what could limit and control the unsealed activities of these eternal ones, aroused from their slumber? Surely he was in the presence of beings akin to gods, to the demons or genii of myth. That which he beheld was like the opening of the sea-recovered jars of Solomon. He saw that the marvelous transformation had also been perceived by the owners of the vessel. These creatures, thronging from all parts of the spheroid interior, began to crowd around the timeless entities. Their mechanical darting motions, the lifting and leveling of certain members that ended in eye-shaped organs, betrayed an unhuman excitement and curiosity. They seemed to be inspecting the transfigured forms with the air of learned biologists who had been prepared for such an event, and were gratified by its consummation. The Timeless Ones, it appeared, were also curious regarding their captors. Their flaming eyes returned the stare of the periscopic tentacles, and certain odd horn-shaped appendages of their lofty crowns began to quiver inquisitively, as if with the reception of unknown sense impressions. Then, suddenly, each of the three put forth a single jointless arm, emitting in mid-air 7 long fan-like rays of purple light in lieu of a hand. These rays, no doubt, were capable of receiving and conveying tactile impressions. Slowly and deliberately, like groping fingers, they reached out, and each of the fans, curving fluctuantly where it encountered a rounded surface, began to play with a rhythmic flaring about the foremost of the double-headed creatures. These beings, as if in alarm or discomfort, drew back and sought to elude the searching rays. The purple fingers lengthened, encircled them, held them helpless, ran about them in broadening, clinging zones, as if to explore their whole anatomy. From the 2 heads to the disc-like pads that served them for feet, the beings were swathed around with flowing rings and ribbons of light. Others of the vessel's crew, beyond reach of the curious beams, had darted back to a more secure distance. One of them lifted certain of his members in a swift, emphatic gesture. As far as Chandon could see, the being had not touched any of the vessel's machinery. But, as if in obedience to the gesture, a huge, round, mirror-like mechanism overhead began to revolve in its frame on massive pivots. The mechanism appeared to be made of some pale, lucid substance, neither glass nor metal. Ceasing its rotation, as if the desired focus had been secured, the lens emitted a beam of hueless light, which somehow reminded Chandon of the chill, frozen radiance of the eternal world. This beam, falling on the timeless entities, was plainly repressive in its effect. Immediately, the finger-like rays relinquished their quarry, and faded back to the jointless arms, which were then retracted. The eyes closed like hidden jewels, the opal patterns grew cold and dull, and the strange, half-divine beings appeared to lose their complex angles, to regain their former quiescence like devolving crystals. Yet, somehow, they were still alive. They still retained the nascent lines of their preternatural efflorescence. In his awe and wonder before this miraculous tableau, Chandon had automatically freed himself from the leather bands, had risen from the hammock, and was standing with his face pressed against the wall of the cylinder. His change of position was noted by the vessel's crew, and their eye tentacles were all raised and leveled upon him for a moment, following the devolution of the Timeless Ones. Then, in response to another enigmatic gesture from one of their number, the giant lens rotated a little further, and the glacial beam began to shift and widen, till it played upon the cylinder, though still including in its hueless range the dynamic figures. The Earthman had the sensation of being caught in a motionless flood of something that was inexpressibly thick and viscid. His body seemed to congeal. His thoughts crawled with painful slowness through some obstructing medium that had permeated his very brain. It was not the complete arrest of all life processes that had been entailed by his impingement upon eternity. Rather, it was a deceleration of these processes, a subjection to some unthinkably retarded rhythm of time, movement, and sequence. Whole years seemed to intervene betwixt the beats of Chandon's heart. The crooking of his little finger would have required lustrums. Through tediously elongated time, his brain strove to form a single thought. The suspicion that his captors had been alarmed by his change of posture, and had apprehended some troublous demonstration of power from him, as from the Timeless Ones. Then, through further decades, he conceived another thought, that he himself was perhaps regarded as one of the godlike beings by these alien time voyagers. They had found him in eternity amid the measureless ranks, and how were they to know that he, like themselves, had come originally from a temporal world? With his altered sense of duration, the Earthman could form no proper conception of the length of the voyage in time-space. To him it was almost another eternity, punctuated at lustrum-long intervals by the humming vibration of the machinery. To his delayed visual perception, the crew of the vessel seemed to move with incredible sluggishness, by imperceptible gradations. He, with his weird companions, had been set apart by the chill beam in a prison of slow time, while the ship itself was plunging through fathomless dimensions of secular and cosmic infinitude. At last the voyage came to an end. Chandon felt the gradual dawning of an all-pervasive light that drowned the vessel's ruddy glow in fierce whiteness. By infinite degrees, the walls became perfectly transparent, together with the machinery, and he realized that the light was coming from a world without. Immense images, multiform and intricate, began to crowd with the slowness of creation itself upon the glaring splendor. Then, doubtless to permit the removal of the guarded captives, the retarding ray was switched off, and Chandon recovered his normal powers of cognition and movement. He beheld an awesome vision through the clear wall, whose transparence was perhaps due to the complete turning off of the vessel's motive power. He saw that the vessel was reposing in a diamond-shaped area, surrounded with architectural piles whose very magnitude imposed itself like irremovable weight upon his senses. Far up in a fiery orange sky, he saw the looming of bulbous Atlantean pillars with platform capitals, the thronging of strange cruciform towers. He viewed with amazement the eerie wonder of unnatural cupolas that were like inverted pyramids. He saw the spiral pinnacles that seemed to support an unbelievable burden of terraces, the slanting walls, like fluted mountain scarps, that formed the base of imagineless cumuli. All were wrought of some shining night-black stone, like a marble quarried from an ultra-cosmic Erebus. They interposed their heavy, lowering, malignant masses between Chandon and the flames of a hidden sun that was incomparably more brilliant than our own. Blinded by the glare and dizzied by those lofty piles, aware also of queer heaviness in all his bodily sensations, doubtless due to an increased gravity, the Earthman turned his attention to the foreground. The diamond area, he now saw, was thronged with people similar to the crew of the time vessel. Like giant, silvery, globular-bodied insects, they came hurrying from all directions on the dark pavement. Arranged in a ring about the vessel were colossal mounted mirrors of the same type that had emitted the retarding ray. The gathering people stopped at some little distance, leaving a clear space between the ray machines and the ship, as if for the landing of the crew and captives. Now, as if in response to some hidden mechanism, a huge circular door was opened in the seamless wall. The folded crane began to lengthen and covered one of the timeless beings with its mesh of tentacles. Then the mysterious entity, still quiet and unresisting, was lifted through the aperture and deposited on the pavement outside. The arm returned and repeated this procedure with the second figure, which, in the meanwhile, had apparently realized the cessation of the retarding beam, and was less submissive than its fellow had been. It offered a rather tentative resistance, and began to swell as the tentacles enfolded it, and to put forth pseudopodic members and finger-like rays that plucked gently at the tightening mesh. However, in a few moments, the second being had joined its companion in the world without. At the same time, a startling change had begun to manifest itself in the third figure. Chandon felt as if he were present at the epiphany of some eon-veiled and secluded god, revealing himself in his true likeness from the molten chrysalis of matter. The transformation that occurred was as if some chill stalagmite should burgeon forth in a thousand-featured shape of cloud and fire. In one apocalyptic moment, the thing seemed to expand, to rush upward, to change its entire substance, to develop organs and attributes such as could belong only to a supermaterial stage of evolution. Eons of star life, of world life, of the slow alchemy of atoms were bridged in that instant. Chandon could form no clear conception of what was happening. The metamorphosis was too far beyond the normal interpretive range of human senses. He saw something that towered before him, filling the vessel to its roof and pressing terribly against the curved transparent surface. Then, with inestimable violence, the entire vessel broke in 1,000 flying, glittering glass-like fragments that shrieked with the high, thin note of tortured things as they hurtled and fell in all directions. Before the last fragments had fallen, the time cylinder was caught and drawn upward from the wreck as if by some mighty hand. Whether the looming giant had reached down with one of its non-human members, or whether the cylinder had been lifted by magnetic force, was never wholly clear to Chandon. All he could remember afterward was the light aerial soaring, in which he experienced a sudden and complete relief from the heavy gravitation of that unknown planet. He seemed to float very swiftly to an elevation hard to estimate, from the absence of familiar scale, and then the cylinder came to rest on the cloud-like shoulder of the Timeless One, and clung there as securely as if it had landed on the shore of some far-off, separate world, aloof in space. He was beyond awe or surprise or bewilderment. As if in some cataclysmic dream, he resigned himself to the unfolding of the swift miracle. He peered out from his airy vantage, and saw above him, like the topmost crag of a lofty cumulus with stormy suns for eyes, the head of the being who had shattered the alien time vessel and had risen above its ruins like a loosed and rebellious genie. Far down he beheld the black diamond area that swarmed with the silvery people. Then, from the pavement, there rushed heavenward, like the pillared fumes of a monstrous explosion, the mounting and waxing forms of the other timeless ones. Tumultuous, awful, cyclonic, they rose beside the first to complete that rebel trinity. Yet, vast and tall as they had grown, the pylons around them were taller. The terrace-bearing pinnacles, the topsy-turvy pyramids, the cruciform towers, still frowned upon them from the glowing, coal-bright air like the dark, colossal guardians of a transgalactic hell. Chandon was aware of 1,000 impressions. He felt the divine and limitless energies, waked from eternal sleep, that were flowing with such dynamic violence in time, and he felt, warring with these, endeavoring to subdue and constrain them, the jarring radiations and malignly concentrated powers of the new world. The very light was inimical and tyrannous in its fiery beating. The blackness of the lowering domes and peristyles was like the crushing fall of 1,000 muted maces, swung by sullen, cruel, silent Anakim. The lens machines on the pavement, revolving, glared upward like the eyes of boreal cyclops, and turned their frosted beams on the cloudy giants. At intervals, the sky lighted with the white-hot flaring, like the reflex of 1,000,000 remote furnaces, and Chandon was aware of surly, infrabass, reverberant, bell-toned clangors, of drum notes loud as beaten worlds, that impinged upon him from all quarters of the throbbing air. The environing piles appeared to darken, as if they had gathered to themselves a more evil and positive ebon, and were raying it forth to stupefy the senses. But beyond this, beyond all physical perceptions, Chandon felt the black magnetism that surged in never-ceasing waves, that clamored before the barriers of his will, that sought to usurp his mind, to wrest and shape his very thoughts into forms of monstrous thraldom. Wordless, and conveyed in thronging images of terrible strangeness, he caught the biddings of inhuman bane, of transstellar hatred. The very stones of the massive buildings were joined with the brains of that exotic people in an effort to resume control of Chandon and the 3 timeless ones. Darkly, the Earthman understood. He must not only submit to the silvery beings, he must do their will in all things. He and his companions had been brought from eternity for a purpose, to aid their captors in some stupendous war with the rival people of the same world. Even as mankind employs in warfare explosives of titanic potency, the silver creatures had desired to employ the time-loosed energies of the eternal ones against their otherwise equally matched foes. They had known the route through secret dimensions from time into timelessness. With well-nigh demonic audacity, they had planned and executed the weird abduction, and they had assumed that Chandon was one of the eternal entities with latencies of immense elan and godlike power. The waves of evil monition rose ever higher. Chandon felt himself inundated, swamped. With televisic clearness, there grew in his mind a picture of the foe against whom he was being adjured to go forth. He saw the glaring perspectives of remote, unearthly lands, the mightily swarming piles of unhuman cities, lying beneath an incandescent sun that was vaster than Antares. For a moment, he felt himself hating these lands and cities with the cold, imagineless rancor of an otherworld psychology. Then, as if he had been lifted above it by the giant upon whose shoulder he rode, Chandon knew that the Black Sea was no longer beating upon him. He was free from the clutching mesmerism. He could no longer conceive the alien emotions and pictures that had invaded his mind. Miraculous ease and sublime security enveloped him. He was the center of a sphere of resistant and resilient force which nothing could subdue or penetrate. Sitting as if on a mountain throne, he saw that the demiurgic triad, contemptuous and defiant of the pygmies beneath, had resumed their magic growth, and were shooting upward to attain and surpass the level of the topmost piles. A moment more, and he peered across the Babylonian tiers of sullen stone, crowded with the silver people, and saw the outer avenues of a mammoth metropolis, and beyond these the far-flung horizons of the unnamed planet. He seemed to know the thoughts of the timeless ones as they looked forth on this world whose impious people had dreamt to enslave their illimitable essence. He knew that they saw and comprehended it all in a glance. He felt them pause in momentary curiosity, and felt the swift, relentless anger, the irrevocable decision that followed. Then, very tentatively and deliberately, as if they were testing their untried powers, the three beings began to destroy the city. From the head of Chandon's white supernal bearer there issued a circle of ruby flame, to detach itself, to spin and broaden in a great wheel, as it slanted down and settled on one of the higher piles. Beneath that burning crown, the unnatural angled domes and inverse pyramids began to quiver, and seemed to expand like a dark vapor. They lost their solid outlines, they lightened, they took on the patterns of shaken sand, they shuddered skyward in rhythmic circles of somber, deathly iris, paling and vanishing upon the intolerable glare. From the timeless ones there emanated the visible and invisible agencies of annihilation, slowly at first, and then with cyclonic acceleration, as if their anger were mounting, or they were becoming more engrossed in the awful and godlike game. From out their celestial bodies, as from high crags, there leaped living rivers and raging cataracts of energy. There descended bolts, orbs, ellipsoid wheels of white or varicolored fire, to fall on the doomed city like a rain of ravening meteors. The builded cumuli dissolved into molten slag. The columns and piled terraces passed in driven wraiths of steam under the burning tempest. The city ran in swift torrents of lava. It quivered away in spirals of spectral dust. It rose in black flames, in sullen auroras. Over its ruins there moved the Eternal Ones, clearing for themselves an instant way. Behind them, in the black and clean-swept levels whereon they had trodden, foci of dissolution appeared, and the very soil and stone dissolved in ever-spinning, widening vortices that ate the surface of the planet and bore down upon its core. As if they had taken into their own substance the molecules and electrons of all that they had destroyed, the Eternal Ones grew ever taller and vaster. Chandon beheld it all from his fantastic eyrie with supernal remoteness and detachment. In a moving zone of inviolate peace, he saw the fiery rain that consumed the ultragalactic Sodom. He saw the belts of devastation that ran and radiated, broadening ever to the four quarters. He peered from an ever loftier height upon vast horizons that fled as in reeling terror before the timeless giants. Faster and faster played the lethal orbs and beams. They spawned in midair. They gave birth to countless others. They were sown abroad like the dragon's teeth of Babel, to follow the longitudes of the great planet to its poles. The stricken city was soon left behind, and the giants marched on monstrous seas and deserts, on broad plains and high mountain walls, where other cities shone far down like littered pebbles. There were tides of atomic fire that went before to wash down the prodigious Alps. There were vengeful flying globes that turned the seas into instant vapor, that smote the deserts to molten, stormy oceans. There were arcs, circles, quadrilaterals of annihilation, growing always, that sank downward through the basic stone. The fire-bright noon was muffled with chaotic murk, a bloody cyclops, a red lacoon, battling with serpent coils of cloud and shadow. The mighty sun seemed to stagger in mid-heaven, to rush dizzily to and fro as the world reeled beneath that intolerable trampling of macrocosmic titans. The lands below were veiled by mephitic fumes, riven momentarily to disclose the heaving and foundering continents. Now to that stupendous chaos the very elements of the doomed world were adding their unleashed energies. Clouds that were black Himalayas with realm-wide lightning followed behind the destroyers. The ground crumbled to release the central fires in volcanic geysers, in skyward-flowing cataracts. The seas ebbed, revealing dismal peaks and long-submerged ruins, as they roared in their nether channels to be sucked down through earthquake-riven beds to feed the boiling cauldrons of internal disruption. The air went mad with thunders as of Typhon breaking forth from his underworld dungeon, with roaring as of spire-tongued fires in the red pits of a crumbling inferno, with moaning and whining as of genies trapped by the fall of mountains in some unscalable abyss, with howling as of frantic demons loosed from primordial tombs. Above the tumult, higher and higher, Chandan was borne, till he looked down from the calm altitude of ether, till he gazed from a sun-like vantage upon the seething and shattered orb, and saw the huge sun itself from an equal height in space. The cataclysmic moan, the mad thunder, seemed to die away. The seas of catastrophic ruin eddied like a shallow backwash about the feet of the timeless ones. The furious, all-devouring maelstroms were no more than some ephemeral puff of dust, stirred by the casual step of a passer-by. Then, beneath him, there was no longer the nebulous rack of a world. The being upon whose shoulder he still clung, like an atom to some planetary parapet, was striding through cosmic emptiness, and spurned by its departure, the ruinous ball was flung abyssward after the receding sun around which it had revolved with all its vanished enigmas of alien life and civilization. Dimly, the Earthman saw the inconceivable vastness to which the Eternal Ones had attained. He beheld their glimmering outlines, the vague masses of their forms, with stars behind them, seen as through the luminous veil of comets. He was perched on a nebular thing, huge as the orbit of systems, and moving with more than the velocity of light, that strode through unnamed galaxies, through never-charted dimensions of space and time. He felt the immeasurable eddying of ether. He saw the labyrinthine swirling of stars that formed and faded and were replaced by the fleeing patterns of other stellar mazes. In sublime security, in his sphere of dreamlike ease and motion, Chandan was borne on without knowing why or whither, and, like the participant of some prodigious dream, he did not even ask himself such questions as these. After infinities of dying light, of whirling and falling emptiness, after the transit of many skies, of unnumbered systems, there came to him the sense of a sudden pause. For one moment, from the still gulf, he gazed on a tiny sun with its entourage of 9 planets, and wondered vaguely if the sun were some familiar astronomic body. Then, with ineffable lightness and velocity, it seemed to him that he was falling toward one of the nearer worlds. The blurred and broadening mass of its seas and continents surged up to meet him. He seemed to descend, meteor-like, on a region of rough mountains, sharp with snowy pinnacles that rose above somber spires of pine. There, as if he had been deposited by some almighty hand, the cylinder came to rest, and Jandon peered out with the eerie startlement of an awakened dreamer to see around him the walls of his own Sierran laboratory. The timeless ones, omniscient, by some benignant whim, had returned him to his own station in time and space, and then had gone on, perhaps to the conquest of other universes, perhaps to find again the white eternal world of their origin, and to fold themselves anew in the pale nirvana of immutable contemplation.